Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks very much for having me in beautiful Budapest. It's good to be here, good to meet everyone, and I hope everybody's excited about data and workforce planning, because Gabor has insisted that it's a topic which everybody's interested in. So I'm going to talk a little bit about workforce planning, strategic workforce planning, and where that kind of sits in the whole ecosystem of recruitment and HR. But more importantly, data, and where does data and external labour market insights fit into all of this process? And how do we build and put a plan into place when talking about strategic workforce planning? So someone said to me, why don't you just ask ChatGPT to write your presentation for you? And I thought, well, yeah, it's a great idea, but we'll get to the crux of this. That the important thing is people are ultimately the really important aspect in all of this. We can get the guidance from someone like ChatGPT, and we can get lots of resources online around what is strategic workforce planning. And look, when we read it like this, it sounds very, very simple. So therefore I asked the question, and I've been in a number of conferences recently, and I work with hundreds of global organizations that are using data, but probably only 10 to 20% at a maximum are actually really doing strategic workforce planning properly. So why is that? But more importantly, where does labour market insights fit into this? So I can't sit and talk about the whole of strategic workforce planning. So I work for a business called Horsefly, and we provide real-time insights. And what we are doing is helping businesses identify where they're going to use data to make an impact. So it's not just about having data, but if we look at strategic workforce planning and this process here, where can we start to implement external labour market insights into this? And you could argue that points 1 and 2 maybe are probably more business focused, but the earlier and the absolute earlier that data is adopted into your organisation at an earlier stage, it has a much, much greater impact. Because actually, when you're forecasting those future workforce needs, having data there allows you to drive strategy. And actually, if we take it to say perhaps number 5 and implementing and monitoring that plan, the big issue there is that decisions have been made around where your workforce should be located, what skills you're hiring for, the salaries you're going to be paying. And actually, the issue with that then is that you're going to be using data defensively to defend yourselves within the talent acquisition community. And I really feel for the TA world right now, because I think you're under intense pressure. I think there's the workloads are increasing and budgets are being restricted. So actually, when we look at where workforce planning can support with this data, and I'm going to show some real data and insights from within the platform in the Hungarian market shortly. But actually, how can we identify the future skills and capabilities using data to understand where is this workforce that we need to hire? So a great case study we've got just recently is with Ørsted, renewable energy business, based out of Denmark, and have always just hired skills into Denmark. Now, the issue with that first arose, and actually when workforce planning started to actually get involved, to say, well, if we have data and we understand where our potential is, we can go anywhere in the world. And actually, without going into the full ins and outs of that whole user case, the long short of it is that they estimated a £30 million saving by identifying skill sets that they would typically hire in Denmark in other places around the world that were cheaper, less demand, and actually that wasn't as competitive to try and hire that talent. So if we take all of this workforce planning aspect, but then we talk about talent acquisition, and I don't think it's wrong talent acquisition using data, because again, most of our clients are using it in a TA space, but I think they're doing some workforce planning, not at the real early stages that I think it can make a real impact. Because what happens when we get data at a TA stage, again, we're using it more defensively to say, we can't do this. We can't hire this skill because it's hard or we're not paying enough. And what we're seeing, though, is that with this data in hand, TA teams are now starting to be listened to, are now starting to elevate what they do in the business and have a much, that seat at the table, if you like, and that's what a lot of businesses are pushing for. So, business partnering models. So I think, all of this is really, really important. There's no right or wrong should it sit with workforce planning and TA. In an ideal world, workforce planning and TA would be singing from the same hymn sheet and both have this data. So the different stages of data. I had to put a good slide up just so it wasn't boring bullet points. So data is your Lego, it's unorganized, and then you will use technology to sort that information and arrange it, putting it into nice piles, and then it's presented visually. Let's take a platform like LinkedIn or Horsefly, for example, that's going to present that. They're explaining it with a story, and meaningful impact comes from people. So how do we superhumanize what we can do as people? Because you can go and find some of this data, but if I gave you a big box of Lego right now, it would take you a long time to sort all of that, let alone start to put it into something meaningful. So I just kind of wanted to sort of really focus on that, because I think, use technology where you can. It can save you time. And what is your cost of time? What is the consulting cost of time? What is the empty seat cost time? All of those things, and talking about the metrics that matter to your organization. Because the biggest challenge that I see with any business looking to buy a platform that provides insights for them is, how do I go to the business and say I need X amount of euros, pounds, whatever it may be, or dollars to be able to actually afford this? So it's thinking further around, how does this data, how do I get it to something actionable and useful that is going to impact the business? So, top labour market IT skills in Hungary. This is real-time data taken from Horsefly. We took a range of the top, most in-demand skills that are out there in the market right now. So, look, there well may be a few more people from different skill sets. So you can see 207,886 people across IT, whether it's Python, Java, you name it, all of the top skills in Hungary, with about 19,000 jobs currently being advertised. So how does this help you? And this is what you start to think. It's great having this. Okay, we understand that. But who do I go and take this to say, if we're going to hire here, can I use this information? So we've got the seller information as well there. And then what I can start to do is say, well, how does that demand look right now compared to the last 3 years? So actually, if we're talking about planning for the future, can we use data from the past to say what has happened? So what you're looking at here, this blue, is you will see a slight dip during the pandemic where demand was high. Demand for IT skills in Hungary has remained high for the last 2 years. It has probably been at the highest point it has ever been in the last 3 years, right away up until January this year. And there's been a slight drop in the demand, probably down to market conditions that everybody's experiencing with the banks and everything else that's going on in high inflation. This starts to look at supply versus demand. It's not the easiest graph to try and explain on screen, but ultimately the lower that black bar that you see, the potentially harder it's going to be to fill. But the blue bar you have there is telling you more candidates. So actually what you can see is Budapest has the most amount of candidates, but it's probably one of the hardest places to find them. And again, look, I never been to Budapest, beautiful city, right? So I know if I was someone saying Hungary, I'd go Budapest. But what about some of the other areas? And particularly some of the large organizations. And if we look at, and I'll show you who are the big sort of organizations that are currently employing these people across Hungary. But actually, how many organizations, or how many of the organizations you work for, are getting, we need to be more diverse with we want 20%, 30% women in tech. Well, there's 14% across the major skills across Hungary. So how are we going to do that if the market is only this? We need to start thinking about the future skills. Can we go to the universities and understand which universities the next generation of female talent in certain skills can go to? And again, if we look at experience breakdown as well, 52% of people have got over 8 years experience. So this can have an impact on your salaries. And again, we look at ranges of salaries. So it's not just going to be basic salary that people are on. And again, who are the businesses? Who am I going to be competing with if I'm looking to hire top talent in Hungary right now? And this data is updated on a 90-day basis. And again, look, this is looking at Hungary as a whole. If I had half an hour, I could probably start drilling into individual towns and cities, saying, how does that change? What happens here? But this is to sort of get you thinking about, why should I use data? If I can understand that Ericsson are the biggest employer, EPAN systems, can we compete with them? What are they doing? What are they going out and saying? But then I go one step further because, okay, let's just look at perhaps some of the Eastern European view. And, Central to Eastern European, we can really start to say, okay, well, what about some of these other countries? How many people are there? And actually, this will give you a better view. If we start looking at supply versus demand, we can see Poland, most amount of people, highest demand. Lower that black bar, it's also quite expensive. Romania is probably, across all of the countries that I've just done a brief report on here, we can see has got the lowest salary. It's got a good amount of people, second largest amount of people with these skill sets across Europe, and there's low demand. That black bar telling me nearly around 50, 55 people available for every job being advertised. But Hungary, hard, probably the second or third hardest across those countries to try and find this talent. So again, as organizations, it's not about saying we shouldn't be hiring in Hungary, but it's looking at those different skills. And you can drill down to those individual skills, not just the market as a whole. So we go to macro to micro level very, very quickly. Gabor just sort of said about a few different areas that we can look at. So if we look at then the manufacturing and engineering. So again, this is how quick, if you imagine you had technology yourself, that you can say, this is how many people there are, this is how many they're getting paid, this is the demand, are we going to struggle? That's quick. That saves you time. That allows you to make an impact on the business who's hiring them. Again, instantly I can see. I can even go and see, and you'll see on the where it says adverts there, I can start to click in and say, who's advertising right now? I've spoken to so many businesses since the pandemic has started saying, we've always been able to hire, we can't now. And it's because, Scotland's a great example in the UK. It's got good workforce, it's got good transportation links, and businesses in London that were no longer tied to having people that are purely based in the office are going, well, there's cheaper talent in Scotland, so I'm going to go hunt there. And there's less competition. We're not going to be competing with some of these big people. So all of a sudden, salaries start going up. And again, we look at the breakdown. We've got a higher percentage of female versus male, a slightly higher percentage of people with 8+ years experience. But again, also looking at the 0 to 3 years experience, if you start to see, and again, using this data, we can start to almost start predicting trends, which is where the business I work for is starting to do, is say, if we could see that was, say, 7% of 0 to 3 years, we're perhaps thinking there's going to be a problem with that come the next couple of years, because demand is going to continually increase and there's not enough people coming into the market. We get an aging workforce, salaries are inflated, and all of those things. And again, we get supply versus demand, looking at the different places in and around Hungary and where people are and how difficult it's going to be. The same again, just really trying to look across how does this data impact where you make a decision to go. New service centres, and again, if the business is just using this from a TA perspective, you're using it to go for the roles that have already been commissioned. If we get it to strategic workforce planning, if we get it into the heads of people, if we get it into workforce planning teams that have visibility of what the business is focusing on, understanding where new service centres, where depots, where warehouses, whatever it may be, we can go and very, very quickly look at that and say, where should we go? Should we be focusing on this particular area? And again, we can do this right down to town by town and individual companies as well. And look, I've kind of whizzed through this, but I want to really just take a minute to sort of think, look, this is something that's been mentioned. There's a number of books out there. If anybody's interested in understanding more around the talent intelligence, the data space, there's a great book out by a guy called Toby Coleshaw, and it's something that he's talked about in the book. Because if we are just going and saying we're doing this because this is what I think, how do we become the experts? How do you give yourself the expert voice? Because without data, and this is so true, it is just an opinion that we have. And I could sit here and say, this is what I think the market looks like in this particular area, but I don't know for definite. And it's probably one of the big things I hear, probably more from a staffing agency side of things and some of the RPOs, that I know my market. But that's great, but how are you going to convince your client or your stakeholder Just because you may have worked in IT recruitment for 10 years, 15 years, you may have worked in whatever you've done, you may be an expert, but how do you portray that message to the business to give yourself the expert voice, to get the organization to make the changes that are necessary? And again, look, we're now seeing reward, we're seeing workforce planning, we're seeing business planning. The earlier and the more people that have access to data within your organization means that when it comes down to a talent acquisition and finding people, there may be challenges. The market changes, and if that's one thing that I've learned, certainly in the 3 years since the pandemic, is we know the world can change very, very quickly. We've seen recessions, we've seen the pandemic. And so what I would say is, look, you can go and get some data yourself. If I go back to that slide where I showed with the Lego blocks, how long is it going to take you to decipher all of that data? So I'm going to say thank you very, very much for taking the time to listen to me today. And just, if I can leave you with that one thought, that without data, you are just someone with another opinion. And that's me. Thank you very much.